Hillview Lodge had always been a quiet guest house on the edge of Yorkshire, nestled between rolling hills and a forgotten graveyard. Locals said it was too still, that even the wind hesitated there. In 1982, the place gained new owners, the Crawfords, who bought it at auction for an unbelievable price. It seemed like fate had given them a dream, but fate sometimes is a mirror that reflects nightmares. On their first day, Mrs. Crawford found an antique mirror hidden behind a boarded-up door in one of the attic rooms. The glass was thick, the frame carved with strange, twisting symbols. She cleaned it carefully and hung it in the main hall. Guests started commenting on how clear their reflections looked. Too clear, some said, as if the mirror showed something deeper than the surface. Then the whispers began. Shadows moved in the glass when no one stood near it. Faces lingered after people walked away. One night, a guest claimed the reflection smiled back at him, even though he hadn't. Over the next 3 years, Hillview Lodge became the site of increasingly strange events. Guests vanishing without trace, reflections screaming silently, and the Crawfords slowly losing their grip on reality. Police investigations brought no answers, only unease. The mirror was eventually removed, but where it went, no one knows. This story is pieced together from police reports, witness diaries, and local accounts. It's about what happens when something watches you back, through the other side of the glass. In the spring of 1982, Thomas and Margaret Crawford arrived at Hillview Lodge with their 2 children, Daniel and Amy. The house stood tall and brooding on a hill overlooking the countryside, beautiful but unsettlingly quiet. The estate agent had warned them that the property had a bit of history, though he hadn't elaborated. The Crawfords didn't care. The price was low, and the view from the back porch was breathtaking. As the family moved in, the silence of the house seemed to press against them. The floorboards creaked in slow, deliberate groans. The air smelled faintly of old wood and something metallic like rust or blood. On their first night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She wandered through the halls with a candle, her footsteps echoing softly. In the main corridor, she noticed a strange draft blowing from behind a panel of wooden boards at the end of the hallway. Curious, she pried at the boards. Behind them, covered in layers of dust, was an enormous mirror, nearly 8 feet tall, framed in dark mahogany carved with twisting, vine-like patterns. Despite the grime, the glass shimmered faintly in the candlelight, as though something beneath its surface was moving. When she called Thomas to help her lift it into the main hallway, the temperature of the house dropped. Their breath turned visible in the air. "Old houses get cold at night," Thomas said with a nervous laugh. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror wanted to be found, as though it had been waiting. That night, as they went to bed, a faint knocking echoed through the house. It came from the direction of the hall. The next morning, the mirror stood proudly in the main hallway, freshly cleaned. Sunlight from the windows poured across it, making the glass glimmer like water. Amy, the younger of the 2 children, stood staring at it while eating her cereal. "Mom," she said quietly, "why is there a man in the mirror?" Margaret froze. "What man, sweetheart?" she asked, forcing a smile. Amy pointed. But when Margaret looked, there was only the reflection of the kitchen behind them. Amy frowned, confused. "He was just there," she whispered. "He was smiling." That afternoon, Thomas left for work, leaving Margaret and the children alone. While dusting the hall, Margaret noticed something strange. Her reflection was delayed by a split second, just enough to unsettle her. When she lifted her hand, the reflection followed slightly after. Her stomach tightened. She blinked, and the reflection was normal again. That night, the temperature in the house dipped again. Amy refused to sleep in her room, insisting that someone was walking behind her when she looked in the mirror. Daniel laughed at her, calling it kid stuff, but even he stopped joking when his bedroom door creaked open by itself at midnight. Margaret awoke to the sound of glass rattling. The mirror in the hall trembled in its frame, though there was no wind. Slowly she approached it. Her own reflection looked back, but behind her, in the glass, stood a shadowed figure, tall, head slightly tilted. She spun around. Nothing. When she looked back, the figure had moved closer in the reflection. She covered her mouth to keep from screaming. 2 nights later, the silence in the house began to breathe. Margaret often worked late in her study, her desk facing the hallway. That's when she first heard it, a faint murmur like someone whispering through glass. At first she thought it was the wind, but when she stepped into the hall, the sound grew sharper, clearer. It was coming from the mirror. She stood a few feet away, straining to listen. The whisper was low, indecipherable, yet strangely rhythmic, almost like a chant. Her skin prickled. She leaned closer. For a moment, she thought she heard her name. Margaret. A cold draft swept through the hallway, snuffing out the candle she'd left burning on the console. She froze in the dark, her own reflection barely visible in the moonlight. Suddenly, a whisper hissed again, louder, right against her ear. She turned sharply. No one was there. The next morning, Margaret tried to explain it away, but the children noticed her pale face. Amy admitted she'd heard voices too, talking in the mirror. Daniel, skeptical but curious, dared his sister to touch it. When she pressed her palm against the glass, she gasped. It was freezing cold, as if it led to somewhere else. That night, Margaret covered the mirror with a sheet. But just before dawn, she was jolted awake by the sound of it crashing to the floor. She ran into the hall. The mirror lay shattered, except for the center, still perfectly intact. In that unbroken patch of glass, a single reflection remained. It wasn't hers. The morning after the mirror shattered, the air inside the house felt heavier. Every sound echoed. Every step seemed to carry weight. Margaret swept up the pieces, but the central shard refused to break even under pressure. She wrapped it in cloth and placed it in the shed, hoping to forget it. That evening, Daniel claimed he saw a man in the hallway mirror downstairs. He wasn't moving, the boy whispered, but his eyes followed me. Margaret dismissed it as imagination until she went to check. The mirror reflected the room normally, except for a faint, dark figure standing behind her reflection. She turned instantly, heart pounding. Nothing was there. Later that night, a violent crash came from the shed. Margaret rushed out with a lantern, her breath frosting in the cold air. The wrapped shard was lying on the floor, uncovered. In the glass, the same man stood clear as day. Tall, pale, dressed in black robes that looked centuries old. His mouth moved slowly, forming words she couldn't hear. Panicking, Margaret hurled the shard to the ground, but it didn't shatter. Instead, the reflection in the glass grinned. The next morning, the family dog refused to go near the hallway mirrors. Its fur bristled, and it barked at its own reflection until it cowered in a corner. At night, Margaret awoke to faint knocking sounds from inside the mirrors themselves. By the third night, she covered every mirror in the house. But when she awoke at dawn, one had been uncovered, and drawn across the glass, written backward in something dark and sticky, were 5 words. You cannot hide forever. For a few nights, the family tried to convince themselves it was over. Every mirror in the house remained covered, the shard locked away in a metal box in the cellar. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. It began again with the knocking, faint at first, like fingertips brushing the wall behind Margaret's bed. Then louder, more deliberate. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. Every night the same rhythm, as if something or someone was trying to answer a question no one had asked. Daniel started sleepwalking again, always stopping at the cellar door. One night, Margaret found him standing there, his hand pressed against the wood. He's waiting, Daniel murmured in a flat voice. He says he wants to see himself again. The next morning, deep scratches appeared on the inside of the cellar door. Whatever was down there wasn't content with waiting anymore. The family heard whispering through the vents, voices too low to understand but too human to ignore. Desperate, Margaret called a local historian who told her something chilling. The man who built the house in the 1800s, Thomas Gale, was obsessed with mirrors. He believed reflections trapped pieces of the soul. After his sudden death, neighbors claimed they saw him standing in his windows long after he was buried. That night, the knocks came from inside the walls of Daniel's room. Margaret ran in to find the wallpaper bulging slightly, as if something were pushing from within. When she touched it, the wall felt cold and damp. Then came a sound that froze her in place, a whisper, clear and close, seeping through the plaster. You shouldn't have covered them. Margaret could barely bring herself to go near the cellar after that night. The door remained bolted shut, Yet the whispers persisted, rising and falling like breath behind the wood. Daniel's drawings grew darker. Every page showed the same tall, featureless figure, its body stretched and cracked like broken glass. Beneath it, he'd written one word: reflection. One morning, when the family awoke, they found the mirror shard box open on the kitchen table. No one admitted to touching it. Margaret wrapped it in layers of cloth and drove it to the far edge of town, tossing it into the old quarry lake. She watched it sink until it disappeared beneath the dark surface. For the first time in weeks, she thought they were free. That night, the house was silent. Too silent. The usual creaks and sighs were gone, replaced by a single low hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The hum deepened into a vibration, making the floors tremble. Then from Daniel's room, a scream cut through the air. She burst in and froze. The mirror above his dresser, one she didn't remember ever buying, reflected not their room, but a dim hallway lined with doors. In the reflection, something moved, a dark figure walking slowly toward the glass from the other side. Margaret grabbed Daniel, but he pointed at the mirror, whispering. He found his way back. As she tried to cover the glass with a blanket, a hand, pale, thin, and impossibly long, pressed against the inside of the mirror. A sharp crack echoed, splintering across the surface. Margaret screamed as her reflection smiled back at her, while her real face did not. The night after the mirror returned, Margaret barely slept. Every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps. Every shadow on the wall seemed to lean toward her. When dawn came, she found Daniel sitting before the mirror again, his face pale and blank, eyes unfocused. His reflection, however, was smiling. "Daniel!" she cried, shaking him. His lips moved, but the voice that came wasn't his. It was deeper, layered, echoing. "He's here now," it said. "He's waiting for you." The air grew heavy, cold enough to sting her lungs. The mirror's surface rippled like black water, and from its depths faint figures appeared. Children, dozens of them, faces pressed to the glass, eyes hollow. Some mouthed silent screams, others simply watched. Then the tall, faceless figure stepped into view behind them, its long fingers stretching out until they touched the other side. The glass cracked again, thin veins spreading outward like spider webs. Daniel's reflection reached out, matching the faceless entity's movement. Terrified, Margaret pulled her son away, but his small hand brushed the mirror. The moment he touched it, the house groaned violently. Every picture frame fell. Windows shattered inward and the lights flickered to black. In the darkness, she heard whispering from all around. Dozens of voices repeating one phrase in unison. "Join us. Come home." She grabbed Daniel and ran toward the stairs, but the hallway had changed. It stretched on far longer than it should have, lined with doors that hadn't been there before. Behind each one, something scratched, slowly, deliberately. The air smelled of old earth and rot. She clutched her son close, whispering, "We have to get out." But deep down, she already knew. The house wasn't letting them go this time. The walls groaned as though the entire house were alive, breathing in the panic that filled its halls. Margaret clutched Daniel and stumbled forward, her bare feet sliding over splintered floorboards. The air had grown thick, like walking through fog made of whispers. Each time she passed one of the new doors, it rattled violently, as though something inside was desperate to escape or to be let in. She reached the bottom of the stairs and froze. The front door was gone. In its place stood another mirror, tall and framed in black wood. In its reflection, the house looked the same, but there were figures standing behind her. Dozens of them, pale, transparent, swaying slightly as if caught in a silent wind. Margaret spun around, but the hallway was empty. She turned back toward the mirror, only to see Daniel's reflection slowly lift his hand and wave. Her son hadn't moved in reality. The temperature dropped suddenly, her breath turning to fog. Then the floor began to tilt, and the sound of wood bending filled the air. The house itself was changing, walls shifting, doors melting into new shapes. The staircase twisted like a corkscrew, leading upward into darkness that pulsed faintly red. Daniel tugged on her sleeve, whispering, "He says we're inside now." Before she could ask who he was, the lights flickered once more. In that brief moment of illumination, she saw what was written across the walls in something that looked like ash and blood. "Every reflection has a home. Margaret pressed Daniel against her chest and ran toward the twisting stairs. The ground beneath her feet seemed to breathe, and somewhere deep within the shifting structure, something laughed. Margaret and Daniel reached the top of the warped staircase, where the air pulsed with low, rhythmic vibrations, like the heartbeat of the house itself. The hallway above was narrow and slanted, lit only by the faint glow of a single candle flickering at the end. Every few seconds it dimmed and flared as if something invisible was breathing on it. Daniel clutched her hand, whispering, "He's getting closer." From the walls came faint tapping, soft at first, then faster, like fingernails drumming impatiently. As Margaret edged forward, the tapping turned into a distorted melody, a humming that rose and fell, and then she saw him. In the cracked mirror at the end of the hall stood a tall man dressed in black, his face nothing more than a blur. He stood completely still, head tilted ever so slightly as though studying them. The candlelight flickered, and suddenly his reflection moved, stepping closer even though the real hallway was empty. Margaret froze. She could feel his gaze, cold and hollow, even through the glass. The man raised his hand and placed it against the inside of the mirror. The glass quivered under his touch, rippling like water. Daniel whispered, "He says he wants to come out." Margaret backed away, but her reflection didn't. It smiled, her face grinning with black eyes. The mirror shattered, but instead of falling, the shards hovered in midair, each one reflecting a different version of the hallway, some empty, some filled with shadows, and one where she saw herself, standing alone. A cold voice drifted from all directions, deep and resonant. "Once you see him, he never leaves." The candle went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. The darkness seemed alive. Margaret could hear the whispering swirl around her, layered voices overlapping until they formed one chilling phrase. "Look closer." A faint glow began to rise from the shards still suspended in the air. Each piece reflected not her current world, but moments of her past. The day they moved into the house, Daniel's laughter, her late husband standing in the doorway. The memories flickered like dying film reels, warm for a second, then melting into black. One shard drifted closer to her face. In it she saw Daniel, but older, pale, and standing alone in a version of the house that looked rotted and empty. Behind him, the faceless man lingered, one hand resting on the boy's shoulder. Margaret screamed and tried to grab Daniel, but he was gone. His voice came from somewhere behind her, distant, echoing. "Mom, it's better here. He said you can stay too." She spun, searching, until she noticed the largest mirror had reformed on the opposite wall. Its surface rippled like a black lake. Slowly, Daniel stepped out of it, not quite solid, his eyes voids of shimmering darkness. He smiled, but it wasn't his smile. Margaret backed away, shaking. "You're not my son." The reflection tilted its head. "Then come find him." The mirror expanded, its surface widening like an open mouth. The entire room began to collapse inward, drawn toward it. Furniture splintered, walls bent, air screamed. With no other choice, Margaret lunged forward, calling Daniel's name. The glass engulfed her whole. When the neighbors finally investigated the abandoned house weeks later, they found the rooms empty, except for a tall, antique mirror hanging in the hallway. Sometimes at night, if you look close enough, you can still see her face inside,